So we're going to start the course out by talking about the definition of graphic design. What is graphic design and how does it differ from art? So basically, just the technical definition of graphic design is the art or skill of combining text and pictures in advertisements, magazines, or books. When you start thinking about that, it's important for you to understand also what graphic design is. It's basically a visual representation of an idea. So designers start out with a problem that they end up solving through the visuals they create. These visual elements include text, imagery, illustrations, or a combination of all three. And it's important to understand also that graphic design always starts with a client. You're not the client. You don't decide the problem. The client or the organization that you're working with creates the problem that then you as a designer will solve. It's important for society, and design really matters because it drives the economy, it provides important information to the public, and it promotes research and development of goods and services. It can serve commerce or it can serve society. And another important thing to understand is often designers don't create every visual element that they put in the work. Sometimes they're given photographs, they're given graphics or charts, or they might be given the text or the font. Other times they might create the graphic, or they might create the image, or they might design a font to be used for the text. How is design different than art? Art has no end. There are no preconditions. An artist decides what they want to create based on something that can be beautiful. It can be something that they're trying to communicate or educate the public about, but it's always their own decision about what gets created. Design, on the other hand, has to serve the client's interests. And often in design, these components already exist: text, photos, formats, colors. And your role as a designer is to put these things together to communicate the message that you're given. There's different kinds of graphic design. So one important thing we'll be doing in this class is we're going to be creating icons and logos. And so this is really important in graphic design. It's called symbol design, visual identity, branding. And we'll talk more about this, but it's really about the consistent visual appearance. So when you create a logo, you try to capture the spirit of a brand or a group. And branding is this entire process of creating the brand name, brand identity. There's also print materials in graphic design. So often designers design letterhead, packaging, posters, brochures, diagrams, for example, maps, marketing materials. They might do book layouts, magazine layouts, newspaper layouts, billboards. There's environmental graphics that designers create. Think trade shows, the signage for airports, museums, installations, navigation systems, outdoor signage for buildings. So there's all of these different graphics that need to be placed in an environment to communicate to the audience that experiences that environment. There's advertising and there's web design. So we'll start out with icons and logos and kind of talking about how important these are in the process for designers. So this is a really famous logo. You've probably all seen it, and it has an interesting history. It was created by William Golden, who was the creative director for CBS in 1951. And Golden's original inspiration came while he was kind of driving through Pennsylvania Dutch country. And he became intrigued by the hex symbol resembling the human eye drawn on Shaker barns. And these symbols were put there to ward off evil spirits. He also came across a drawing in a Shaker art book from the 1850s that looked like this eye. So here's kind of an example of something he probably saw while he was driving around. And he then created the CBS logo based on this idea. And logos are, like I said, important because they try to capture the spirit. They try to convey information and capture the spirit of the organization. They also have specific requirements. Usually logos are used in a lot of different places. You might use them on a website, you might use them in a television commercial, you might use them in print material. So they have to be simple enough to not overwhelm everything else that's in the design. And you can see the CBS logo does this beautifully. You can put this logo almost anywhere and it works. It adds, it doesn't detract or make the viewer focus too much on it. It's a really simple, elegant design. There's also the ABC logo. This is for the American Broadcasting Company, designed by another famous designer, Paul Rand. You'll probably look at some of these designers I'm talking about in this lecture for your designer research project, which is going to be due next week. And there's the Nike logo. So if you notice, of the three logos I just showed you, they all have a simplicity about them. They aren't overly complicated, and they are seamlessly going to fit in a lot of different situations. So the Nike logo also has an interesting history. It was designed by Carolyn Davidson in 1971, and she was just this young student at Portland State University. She was doing some freelance work, and one of her teachers asked her to design a logo that could be placed on the side of a shoe. She handed him this swoosh, and he handed her $35. In the spring of 1972, the first shoe with the Nike swoosh was introduced, and the rest is pretty much history. Later, she made a lot more money than that on this design, by the way. A couple of other designs, Paul Rand again. You can see the IBM logo. So those stripes were there to suggest speed and energy. The Westinghouse logo was also designed by Paul Rand. Circles are often used in logos because they contain the graphic. And the UPS logo, United Parcel Service. So Paul Rand was an amazing logo designer, and many of these logos that we've grown up seeing were designed by him. Another important designer we'll look at is Saul Bass. He designed the AT&T logo, the Quaker Oatmeal logo, and the United Airlines logo. So logos are these symbols, and they can come from many different places, many different ideas, and they're usually a simplification or an abstraction of that idea. And that's important because, as I said before, a logo needs to be simple, it needs to be versatile, it needs to be memorable. So there's three qualities you really have to focus on. And then the fourth quality of a logo that you really have to consider is it really needs to be appropriate. It needs to convey that message or that idea that the company or client is trying to communicate. They're always used in this system. So this system of visual continuity is really important, a consistent visual appearance for a company. And it starts with the logo. And this process of a look for all pieces, beginning with the logo and colors, then application to print, web, packaging, signage, and the environment, is called branding. So here's an example, Saks Fifth Avenue. And you can see that you mix things up when you brand. It doesn't always have to look exactly the same, but you want this visual consistency that carries from the product to perhaps the store, the internal design of the store, and to the logo itself. Levi's, you can also see this kind of visual consistency of their product. They have this label on the jeans, they have their signage, they have their advertising. They're using the color red in this particular campaign. But it's versatile too. You could potentially use other colors and you can mix the graphics up. So as a designer doing identity design, you're going to begin with the logo and you're going to apply that logo to the things that you then design and create, like the business card, the envelopes, the letterhead. And we'll definitely do this process in the class. Sometimes there's creative solutions. Stamps, for example, were popular for a while, where you design a symbol, then have a stamp, and then you stamp it onto the product. Kind of creates a visual look. Here's just an example of a system. And it all looks so beautiful together. It makes sense. It creates this experience for the audience. This is called a full bleed here, when you take the graphic and you kind of bring it all the way to the edge of the page. Here's the Nike logo again, and we're going to look at the Nike logo in environmental design. So environmental design is a specific area of design where you're trying to solve a problem about the information or identity communication in a constructed or natural environment. So this almost always has to do with architectural interiors. It can also be about exhibits in museums, but the Nike does a beautiful job with this environmental design. So they take their products and they include them in the design, and the whole interior of the space makes sense. Here's the sign outside. Graphic designers, when they do something like this sign, for example, they'll do it in Adobe Illustrator, and then they would send it out to a commercial printer, and then the commercial printer is the one that makes it giant and makes it work as a sign. Here's Nike Town, and you can see these beautiful ads. The products are always laid out in a very specific way. Ben & Jerry's are also famous for their environmental design, and they're just so much fun. So they have all these colors, all these playful graphics, and their whole factory is just considered from the very basic elements like the design of the products themselves to the design of the actual machinery and factory that the product is being made in. So Ben and Jerry were these two American hippies, basically, who met in the 1970s and set up their own ice cream shop in Vermont after they had taken a $5 correspondence course in ice cream making. And you can see how big their empire has spread today. So here's the signage for their store, and this would be just a decal you put on, but you can kind of see how it is very simple in a sense that they want to put this Ben & Jerry's logo on many different things, so they keep it simple. Here's their actual factory. I love how they label these containers so you know what's inside of them. It's really fun. Here's a little, just a big kind of sign outside their store. You can put your own face in it, and you can see how fun their graphics are and how they really kind of mix it up with their design process. Inside the store, there's so many different things going on. So the walls would probably be painted by maybe a muralist. There's the menus, the brochures, the product containers. There's these little sculptures. There's these things hanging from the ceiling so you can see their products, like the umbrella, for example. Their hats, they have mugs. They basically sell a lot of different products in this store. Here's their ticket for their factory tour. And the walls are just beautifully done. They use different colors, but it all makes sense. So there's so much going on, but there's also a visual harmony that's occurring in this system. And it's important in environmental design that you're thinking about this identity, you're thinking about this consistent visual appearance, like you did when you were just creating the basic icons and logos for the system. Here's some of their t-shirts. Here's their factory tour brochure. And you can see their menu. Menus are actually really challenging to design because you have to make them look good. There's often a lot of text. You can't be too confusing in your layout. So it's a challenging process to create a menu as a designer. Here's the graveyard. This is all the flavors that didn't make it. It's kind of fun. So packaging is another kind of specific area of design, and it's important as a graphic designer to consider a package as a three-dimensional object. So here's just some beautiful examples of packaging. And this is a great example of no graphic, no image, but very sophisticated and simple. Sometimes designers do this because they're on a tight budget and they want to just use grayscale. Sometimes they do it because it is very sophisticated and it gives the product a real elegant feel and look. So here's kind of having fun. This package uses different colors, so you can see the visual consistency, but they kind of mixed it up with the color using a varied palette. and the text is different for each of these little boxes. CD covers and cases are challenging to design because you have to think about the outside, the text, the interior, but the whole thing is a package that has to be viewed from different sides, but also as one entity. So here's just a beautiful example of visual integration and connectivity. Here's some chocolate packaging. So you can see this is nice how they're using transparency here, and then they have this little label they put on top. Audrey Brand Identity was an internet appliance company, and they were trying to kind of capture a young, hip, urban audience, and they were kind of referencing the 1950s, the coolness of the 1950s. And so you can see here with this product, it's a really different audience. Boneyard Pencils was aimed at high school students, and so it's a little bit more edgy, a little bit more rugged, edgy. And so going back to that idea that you have to think about your audience, you always have a specific idea in your mind of who you want the design to affect and capture. And that's not to say that I, as a teacher at DVC, wouldn't buy Boneyard Pencils if I saw this packaging, but I'm not that audience. I'm not a young teenager in high school. And so it's not targeted at me. Doesn't necessarily mean I won't buy it. It just means that the designer is trying to target a specific group. If you don't do that, the process is really challenging. And a lot of times new designers tell me, or new students who are becoming new designers tell me, it's for everybody. This design is trying to intrigue everybody. And that's actually impossible. If you don't focus, then your design won't be successful. If you don't target, your design won't be successful. Posters are probably the funnest thing to design. They're big, they're beautiful. Often you don't have a ton of text you have to deal with, and there's a real clean message that you're trying to communicate. And we will design a poster in here. We're going to also be talking in this class about type terms. Often in design, you're dealing with type, almost always. And so you should have a little bit of history. So we'll learn about leading and kerning, and we'll kind of look at the old style metal type terms a little bit in here. So here's kind of the old typographic plates that were used, where you would put these letters together, and you would have these little metal plates that you would put between the letters to separate them and make them a little bit larger. And that's where these old typographic terms kind of generate from. Here you can see all these letters. So each box holds a different letter, and there's all these different fonts that you can design with. Now with the invention of computers, there's just so many different options for fonts that it's amazing. And designers are often kind of looking at a font, modifying a font, changing a font, creating a new font to work with whatever idea they're trying to communicate. We'll also learn a little bit about history in here. We'll look at different movements like the Art Nouveau movement. Here's the Unita Biscuit Boy, and he was the corporate symbol of the National Biscuit. So what's kind of fun is when you look at these old advertisements or this old signage, these old logos from the late 1800s to early 1900s, it's amazing how far design has come, and you'll see how illustrative these designs were. So graphic design actually has really kind of transformed the way that we visually communicate in the world. And it all started in kind of the late to mid 1800s. Here's Coca-Cola. Coca-Cola has been around for a long time. Their logo was inspired by Art Nouveau, and it's been extremely successful. This is the original advertisement for Coca-Cola. It was called Coca Wine, and it was supposed to be almost like a medicine to help with fatigue of mind and body. Text and letter design we're going to be just really thinking about letters as shapes in here. And we'll be learning about serif, sans serif fonts. We'll be talking about the spacing between letters and how it can affect the way the viewer perceives the design, if there's too much or too little spacing. So letters are very important, fonts are very important. It's all part of graphic design. It doesn't seem very interesting. Like if you think of the word typography, often people who aren't designers yet aren't intrigued by that, and they just think of typography as something very mundane. But typography is actually so inspirational when you get down to how these letters are created and the purpose that they were created for. Okay, just here's like kind of the visual consistency of Coca-Cola. They were pretty innovative in the late 1800s in terms of graphic design, and really, I think their ability to really make this product have visual consistency made them the empire they are today. So they would create these products, these calendars, their bottles were beautiful. They put this, the logo on their trucks. They created these advertisements. So this visual consistency was pretty innovative at that time. So they were doing branding kind of at the beginning of the onset of branding before it really became a concept. Another beautiful example of a poster done in the Art Nouveau style. We'll also be looking at different movements like Italian Futurism, for example. We'll be comparing and contrasting these movements, and we'll be kind of talking about what was happening in society at the time of the movement and what inspired the movements. There's another example of Italian Futurism, and you can kind of compare and contrast that to the first movement we looked at, which was Art Nouveau. And here's a poster done in the Italian Futurism style. So a great organization to look at is AIGA if you want to like really look at poster design and look at some really beautiful, amazing posters. You can go to their website. Here's an interesting design because the audience is unclear. So is this a good design or a bad design? It depends on what the design is for. So it would be a bad design in terms of capturing the attention and interest of a broad audience. It might be okay if the audience is all very familiar with the content and they're really specifically looking for something in the content and understand the layout. So design is kind of relative to who and what you're designing for. This is a great poster. There's nothing quite as rewarding. So what the designer is trying to do is capture that idea of adult literacy and how hard it is if you can't read. I love this poster because of the layering. This is just an old movie poster, but I love the layering of the text and the image. This would have been done in Photoshop. Sometimes you want to use contrast. This is a beautiful example of that, where they're using the positive and the negative inverse of an image, and then they're using this kind of decorative, elegant, beautiful font and kind of putting it next to this kind of powerful sans serif font, and it says knowledge without action and then destroys down here. So the contrast makes us look and makes us kind of interested. So there's also magazine and book layout. And that's kind of its own specialty area within graphic design. There's brochure and ads. This is an amazing example of an advertisement or a brochure for this architectural mesh company. It's very sophisticated. It kind of reminds me of the Audrey appliance design, where they did these beautiful photographs of mesh and then they laid it out inside of the brochure with their text, and they would kind of ghost the text with these red backgrounds. This is a beautiful example of just innovative typography and using type as visual and using type to tell the story. Another example, I love the layout of this text block and how it's mimicking this figure. It's also clever how they're kind of bolding the first few words in each of the sentences to kind of give that feeling of the shadow of the figure. This is a CD design, and they're using the colors cyan, magenta, yellow, and black, which are the colors for commercial printing. This beautiful magazine layout. You can see that this graphic here is kind of mimicking the graphic on the other side, and they're using the circle as kind of a connecting visual here. This is a book design, and sometimes you can do this, just take a big, beautiful, interesting photo and just spread it out from the back to the front. So you can imagine if you fold this book cover, this would be the front on this side, which is an interesting design. The layout of the text is really working with that image. Then you have the spine here, which if you fold it over, you're not going to see the face or the arm anymore, but you still kind of get this contrast and balance. And then the back image. So it's gonna create three interesting compositions, but then all together it works visually as well. And then they use this little border down here to get the rest of the information in. So sometimes that's really effective. If you can't put the text in the space because the image is kind of too overwhelming, or it's just you're not able to kind of fit it in, you can take a color or a texture and kind of make a big shape at the bottom or at the top and then lay out the rest of your text. Here's kind of a creepy book design, The Little Friend, so it's meant to kind of startle and agitate, make us interested. Advertising is kind of its own area, and it is the intent of advertising is to inform, to persuade, to promote, to provoke, and to motivate on behalf of a brand or a group. And so it's an important part of graphic design because this is the part that really drives the economy. So this was an ongoing ad campaign to promote novelist Ross Campbell's new novel, Wet Moon 3. Very clever with the illustration and photo combined together. You can see this was probably done in Photoshop, but it's just, kind of startling but interesting. This was a Yamaha bike helmets ad. Target did this amazing job where they created a series of ads to kind of change the way Target was seen by the consumer. And they did this Sign of the Times branding campaign, which they turned into a print ad where they took all these kind of old retro looking graphics and photographs, and they put them together to make it kind of trendy and more appealing to an audience that wouldn't otherwise have thought Target was cool. So how they did this is they wanted to become more of a trendy retailer. And so they did these things like they put a cat bed on top of this amazing model's head. So she looked like this old stylish model from like the 40s, 50s. And they took like this is a vacuum cleaner, and they made it look like bagpipes. And so they were really clever in the way they laid their imagery out. And then notice up here this little Target logo, which seamlessly goes into all of the advertisement. And it works. It's a dual message. It's conveying the idea of the target, the literal target, and it's just working with the advertising campaign. And the idea being Target is both practical and stylish at the same time. And I think this was very effective. And it did ultimately attract a whole new segment of society to come and shop at Target. And there's environmental design. So environmental design solves problems about information or identity communication in constructed or natural environments. So we're thinking about architectural interiors or exteriors here. Airports, for example, need this signage that directs people and makes it very easy for people who maybe don't speak English to understand where they're going or where they need to go. So there's some signage at an airport. Museum installation always has this really amazing environmental design. It kind of has to go with the artwork. It has to enhance the artwork. And so this was one room, and it's in an exhibition called Architecture and Design. This was another room in the museum, and you can see how different it is depending on what they're placing in the actual area. They need to think about the colors, they need to think about the text that they're going to place on the walls, and it all has to kind of seamlessly make the artwork the focus. Information design, and this is creating a system to establish a consistent visual appearance. So we've kind of talked about this a little bit, but it's making large amounts of complex information clear. Think charts, graphs, signs, pictograms, symbol signs, icons, websites, or sign systems. So this is an example of the Olympic pictograms. Every time there's an Olympics, it's done in a different country, and that country designs its own original pictograms. So you can see how different it is when the pictograms were displayed in Beijing as opposed to Lake Placid or Moscow. This is an annual report, and annual reports for big companies are these amazing design projects where they have these big reports, and they're trying to attract the investor. They're trying to talk about what their company is about, their product, their organization. And so this can be a great job for a designer, because you can create some really amazing, beautiful designs in these annual reports. So here's another one. You can kind of see some of the graphs that were put in this one were just amazing. This is a talk chart, and it was designed to communicate to patients in hospitals who couldn't talk. The designers were actually students at Kean University, and this was donated to over 2,000 hospitals, and this would fall under the category of information design. A menu. I talked about this before and how challenging these are to design, because you want to make them look good, basically. You want to make them look like the restaurant and maintain this visual consistency with what the rest of the restaurant is designed like, and also the idea and the concept behind the food and the restaurant needs to be somehow integrated into the visual style of the menu. And then you have so much text you're working with that it becomes kind of a challenge. Here's another example of a menu, very different. So this was interesting. Medical textbooks need sometimes to have this information design, and this was an example in a medical textbook trying to communicate what the brain looked like as it suffered from different diseases. So you can see this row here is alcoholism, this is dementia, this is a normal brain. So it was just beautifully done, and it really kind of communicates how these diseases affect us. This is a public transportation map. It's very important for these to be done well so that people know how to get to places they want to go. This was a beautiful design for the VW bus. So it took these numbers, it sliced the bus in half, and then you can kind of see where everything is according to number here. And this was a design for orbital pollution. And it was done to kind of communicate how much debris is circling the Earth. And it was an illustration, but it really communicates that idea. So going back to the goal of information design is to make complex information simple and clear, which can be a very challenging task. So I'm going to stop the lecture today, and hopefully this gets you inspired and makes you start thinking about all these different areas, and we'll be kind of exploring a lot of these areas in the class.